More than a few days before the filming of this video, I was finally given a perfect look into the American public's psyche. I watched as what is supposed to be the progressive wing of their nation, Pokemon, go to the polls and state after state decide for an option which is objectively, and I'm sorry but this is not up for debate, the worst choice. The dust is now settled on two candidates. And what I'm about to say might be a bit harsh, but I honestly don't even care. No matter what your ideology is, not seeing the fact that Mr. Biden is nothing but a career politician with an incredibly problematic past, where he voted for racist and apartheid legislature, where he supported wars which caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands, and a man not able to discern his wife from his sister.
By the way, this is my little sister Valerie, and I'm Jill's husband. Oh no, this is Val, you switched on me. This is my wife.
The word white from rich.
We have this notion that somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
A man with such obvious mamuvam yebem completely obvious mental issues that voting for him should be a telltale sign that you are either gullible beyond belief, a boomer, or simply out of touch with reality. I would not get in a car he's driving. I wouldn't trust him with my 10-year-old niece. And yet, such a massive amount of people. At the moment of filming, the actual majority of the American population believes this man deserves the right to govern the world's richest and most powerful country. If you do not find this absurd, laughable hell worthy enough of a Monty Python sketch, then I don't really think I have anything of value to give to you. And that's not all. To top it all off, he was running against a man with a record so clean, with a history so profoundly dedicated to the pursuit of justice. A man that somehow managed to be on the right side of history almost throughout his entire life. And you would still vote for my best friend is black, Biden. I mean, at least people that voted for Trump have an excuse. The alternative was pretty shite as well. But people voting for Biden have little to none. Yet still, even though I feel disgusted towards their willing, and sometimes, unwilling, decision to go through life as mere grass, tilting to the wind and bowing to the boot, I will still, till my dying breath, defend their right to vote in a world such as this one. Because no matter how problematic, the vote might just be our last line of defense against those too powerful for any of us to individually address. Oh, and before any American suburban white mother points at me and tells me I'm the definition of an angry Bernie bro, please add Russian acid and agitator to the slur. I mean, you people probably think anything east of Berlin is Russia anyway. That is, if you can even point out where Berlin is in the first place. So, the question stands. On what grounds do I believe everyone deserves the right to vote? Well, I've spent a good chunk of my life debating that with myself, so I chose to consult with far smarter thinkers than me on the subject. Though, before we begin, I have to note that we are debating voting rights inside of the parliamentary neoliberal structure, the system as it is right now. I am not talking about reformism versus revolution. I'm simply looking at the question of who, if anyone, deserves the right to cast a vote at the current moment. Democracies choose bad policies. Bryan Caplan, an adjunct scholar for the Cato Institute, a right-wing libertarian think tank, discusses in his book a multitude of biases linked to one's worldview, which directly influence how one can vote and how one votes, eliminating the idea that rationality in the masses can be fully established because of their biases towards markets, foreigners, and so on. He titles this Rational Irrationality, applying market theory to why people don't really put too much effort in how they cast their ballots, but instead follow their intrinsic previously mentioned biases. So, While he's definitely onto something, just like any other American style libertarian, he sacrifices all potential to make a good point at the altar of Big Daddy free market economics, and offers us a solution bathed in hundreds of potential issues. He implies that things would be much better if before election time we all just took an economics exam. Now, there's plenty of other writers and thinkers that went in a similar fashion. Just instead of economics, it was IQ tests, psychological analysis, levels of education, skull sizes, and so on. If any of these sound appealing for even a second, that means you happen to be among the people who would get to vote. So shake off your ego and follow on. Even though at a first read it might sound kind of rational to limit the right to vote to people who are widely deemed as superior. But might I remind you that historically men and women have bled, died, and killed for this right you are so carelessly about to toss away. Should we be this quick to doubt something which took so many generations to get? And who's to say who is smarter or dumber or more or less educated? Is a doctor more educated than an engineer? Why should a hairstylist vote on military intervention? Do pilots deserve more rights than miners just because they passed some fancy exams? These are all just the silly problems that immediately come to mind. But if expanded, they could be incredibly nefarious. If the world is this imbalanced today between those who have and those who have not, imagine what it would look like tomorrow when the wealthy don't only begin to hoard wealth, but also electoral power. Which is what is kind of happening at the moment through the legalization of lobbies and super PACs, allowing for people who have more capital to quite literally have a bigger impact on elections than anyone else. Whew, that was a long read. The vote should only be given to the wisest among us. Plato had the jolly idea of giving voting rights only to so-called educated guardians, people free of negative societal influence and elevated mental, intellectual, and emotional capacity. This, of course, would be absolutely lovely, but I am yet to meet a single goddamn human who would classify as such. John Stuart Mill rode in on his high horse and suggested people with higher education should get more votes. In the United States, elites who feared the ignorance of poor immigrants tried to restrict ballots. In 1855, Connecticut introduced the first literacy test for American voters. They helped racists in the South circumvent the 15th Amendment and disenfranchise blacks. And even in immigrant-rich New York, a 1921 law required new voters to take a test if they couldn't prove that they had an 8th grade education. About 15% flunked. Voter literacy rates weren't permanently outlawed by Congress until 1975, years after the civil rights movement had discredited them. But let's look at voting rights that we've already suppressed and kept suppressed, of those under 18 or 16 and 21 respectively in different countries. The usual response in defense of this idea is that children are too young to understand the complicated nature of the world, and as such should not be given the right to help dictate how it's run. Yet, what do we do when we have a 15-year-old who understands economics, geopolitics, and the inner workings of society better than a 45-year-old? Objectively, this teenager is a more rational, more informed voter than his older and more smooth-brained counterpart. Wouldn't you agree? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, the 15-year-old, for all his knowledge, has almost no life experience on average, and as such is objectively underqualified to vote. But why does lack of experience innately supposed to trump the value of knowledge? I personally don't have an answer to that, but it seems we, as a species, have decided that in old age comes wisdom, even though most data suggests it simply doesn't. If you want to learn more about that, check out my video on how liberals turn conservative. You'll find a link in the description below. Furthermore, according to Australian philosopher Peter Singer, if we base voting rights and de facto human rights in general on the basis of knowledge, then newborns would qualify as what? Animals? Hell, as less than animals, because they lack both knowledge, experience, and skill to do anything. But because we know babies can potentially grow into full adults, well, dolphins can't, we give them their rights on a loan of sorts, I guess, knowing that one day they have the potential to serve the world the way the world has served them up until that point. At least babies that are privileged enough to grow up in the developed world. But what about people with severe mental disabilities? Those with little to no chance of ever seeing the world the way we do? Do we simply strip them of their vote because they happen to be born the way they are? Of course not. And not only from the perspective of ethics and being a decent goddamn fucking human being, but also from a completely pragmatic and selfish able-bodied standpoint. If we can define something as a disability today, what's stopping future governments from expanding that definition, making it even easier for them to choose who they give the right to vote to or not? Even with elections as strict as today, through gerrymandering in the US and hundreds of different electoral manipulations in the developing world, parties and leaders shift the voting power of certain classes and demographics over that of who they consider their base. Now that we've looked at the question of who should vote, and I believe it is self-evident that although massively flawed and incredibly problematic in its nature, voting rights should remain expanded to all. Even those so up their asses that they would vote for bigots and corporate chills, because unfortunately trying to apply any sort of filter to the electoral process could have disastrous results. But now let's expand that a little bit. Let's ask what a vote is. Google says it's a formal indication of a choice between two or more candidates or courses of action expressed typically through a ballot or a show of hands. Okay, sounds good, nerd. But in human terms, let's consider each vote as a push in the direction you would like to see your country go in. Middle class and working people have a very limited way of expressing that. They can campaign, donate the small amounts of money that they can afford to, and of course go to the ballots and actually vote. They can push depending on their vigor in a more or less powerful fashion. But no matter how many put in hours, days, sweat, blood, and tears into a candidate they like, no matter how grassroots the movement is, in comparison to the push a single check written by a millionaire or a super PAC billionaire, their efforts are unfortunately in vain. I'm not trying to be a doomer here. I'm just putting across how the game works, and how sometimes breaking it is the only way of winning it. So, if the rich and powerful have a heavier sway over who gets into office, then do we really have equal access to choosing the future of our nations? John Stuart Mill thought more educated people should get more votes. And as we've seen, that's incredibly problematic. But is there really a difference? Nowadays, instead of education, it's accumulated capital that gives you access. And instead of additional votes, it gives you access to lobbying and political investments. One's influence, the strength of one's push, as we previously chose to define it, during an election is not the same for everyone. Quite literally, if you have enough money, you can afford to massively invest in swaying the election in your favor. Where I'm from, it's, under the table gray money business deals, but only because our mobsters don't have enough capital to lobby out in the open. But the oil, pharmaceutical, and other industries sure do. They buy congressmen and women so legally and so often that it has stopped even being a big deal in the eyes of the many. I'm not even sure most politicians see it as a big deal. It has been naturalized to the extent that not doing it is seen as problematic. Therefore, in conclusion, the main problems which cause such disastrous electoral results like the one we've discussed don't come as a fault of the poor or as a fault of minorities that have lower access to education, but as a rather much more nefarious problem, the fact that the vote of an average human matters less in the grander scheme of things than the vote of a billionaire. The question which we pose at the beginning of this video essay is innately wrong. It's not about restricting the vote for more people, but quite the opposite. Democratizing more aspects of our wider society and giving more of a vote to more people at more crossroads. That's how we achieve what we've strived for over a millennium. Actual Yebema democracy. I would like to take this opportunity to humbly thank all my patrons, especially Crouton and Baguette, for their invaluable support. If any of you are considering supporting what I do, you can find a link to my Patreon or PayPal below. It would obviously help me out a lot. But if you can't, please subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss any of my insidious Eastern European propaganda. Have a good one, Tavarishi.